Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me now? Testing, testing. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome back from lunch, everybody. I would like to introduce our last speaker of the afternoon and our closing for the conference, Tim Waterman. Tim Waterman is a professor of landscape theory and interprogram collaboration director at the Bartlett School of Architecture at the University College London. He is chair of Landscape Research Group and non-executive director of Furtherfield, an arts organization exploring the relationship between technology and mankind. Waterman is also an advisor to the Center for Landscape Democracy of the Landscape and Spatial Planning Institute at the NMBU in Norway, and international advisor to the Center of English Translation and Anglo-Portuguese Studies, Mapping Utopianism's research area. He is former vice president of the European Council for Landscape Architecture Schools. Tim Waterman's research addresses imaginaries, the moral, political, ecological, radical, and utopian. This forms the basis for explorations of power and democracy and the sharing of public space and public life, of taste, manners, belief, and ritual, and the foodways in community and civic life and landscape. We are so grateful that Tim was able to make it all the way out here to Eugene, Oregon for this year's Hopes Conference. We invited Tim to provide that utopianist perspective and closing our conference with a more futurist vision. So, with that, please welcome Tim Waterman.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you most sincerely to all of the organizers for bringing me. I do appreciate how much work goes into these conferences and how exhausted you're all going to be at the end of it. So it's very much appreciated. And of course, I just get to bask in the glory of all of your work up here. So I'm incredibly grateful. Has everyone got their AIA information for the CPD? I'm probably going to talk about stuff the AIA would rather I didn't, because I'm going to try to change the course of practice. That's really something that's part of my goal, is to think about what the future of practice is, and I do use utopian imaginaries to address that. So there will be some utopianism, and I'm also going to talk about this idea of planetarity, which is a word that comes to us from Gayatri Spivak's work. I don't use the term quite the way she does, so I'll try to explain it a bit more as I go through. I guess another thing that I might say here right at the title slide is that you'll notice that I'm no longer on Twitter. So it's the old and wonderful Audre Lorde line about the master's tools. In this case, the master is a real piece of work. And I'm not going to participate in a white supremacist platform. So I'm on Mastodon and I'm on Blue Sky. Mastodon's a little bit kind of techie, but it works. So don't let the naysayers say, oh, it's really difficult to get on with it. I think that's properly the future because it's federated, it's decentralized, and no one person or corporation can take control of it. So one thing that you really should do in your institutions as much as you can is lobby your institutions to start their own Mastodon server, what's called an instance, so that you can begin to decentralize your own institution and bring it into the Fediverse. So there are radical ways that we can transform the internet, and I would also recommend reading Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, has just recently published a kind of call to arms on the 35th anniversary, saying we need to resist what Cory Doctorow calls the enshittification of the web, and we need to fight for a fairer web, because actually the world we live in and the internet are mutually constituted now, right? They are interpenetrating. You can't pull them apart. So the world we live in is also the world of the web. So we've got to transform that as much as we transform places. So there's a duty of care there. Care, which is something we don't get from the overlords. Okay, positionality. We've had a lot of wonderful discussions here about where am I coming from? Interestingly, I came out of a US Navy family, so I'm a military brat, I'm a Navy brat. So people ask me where I'm from, and actually I get the where are you really from question a lot as well, because I'm not really from anywhere. I have made a home everywhere in my life, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm into landscape, because everywhere I've moved over the years, I've had to ask the question, how does this place work? How do I operate this environment? And I think that's really at the heart of landscape studies, is understanding how places operate, what the relationships are that make those places move, how you can be part of them. So I think you'll see that sensibility kind of in my work as well. I'm living in London and teaching at University College London. I was born in San Diego, California, lived on both coasts, lived in Iran, lived in Germany, lived in London as a kid, and now again as a grown-up. And I think also as a queer man, that has very much informed my worldview as well. Certainly at the time that I began to get involved in queer activism was a time when we were very much aware that we needed solidarity with other social justice movements and racial justice movements, and now spatial justice movements, we would say, in order to bring things forward, in order to make things happen. So solidarity and being able to speak across is really, really important. This is not necessarily an image that talks about speaking across. Well, I guess it is in a way. So this is the portico at University College London. Neoclassical architecture. There's, right here at the center, you get the sense of the universe in the university with the observatory that's there. And also kind of who is being educated. So right here at the center, you have one of two ephebes, so naked youths perched at the top of the staircase. They're both male. So again, that kind of speaks about who was being educated in the institution. Neoclassical white male. The other thing I think that kind of updates this image a little bit is the surveillance camera at the apex of the pediment. All of our publicity goes out with images of the portico, and nobody ever thinks to go into Photoshop and like get rid of that. So it's part of our iconography, that surveillance camera. It stands for the university. It stands for the contemporary university, I think, in a lot of ways. In terms of the Jeffersonian ideal, that's also the library, or it's one of the libraries at the center of the institution. The president and vice provost are there, but they're slightly off to the side. The library is at the center. But I think also the other thing is that we're also at the heart of empire. The British Empire emanated from this source, and this was the learning that was propelling that empire, was coming from places like UCL and Oxford and Cambridge. So a lot of people around the world look to that institution, and I think it's an interesting place for me to be, because I'm holding the master's tools in this institution. So what I do with them is really, really important. In a way, I'm in a position to dismantle my own house. And again, I have very subversive aims to do so. I think it requires a different worldview. I think it requires a different way of looking at the world. And I want to show you, this is about a 2 and a half minute or so video from British Pathé. I'll let it speak for itself, and then I'll speak to it. It's from 1955, and I think you'll find it charming.
From the reenactment of an historical ceremony to a place where history is always being repeated. Here, at a famous North London firm of geographers, 60,000 globes of the world are made every year. How How the real world began has always been a fascinating study, but there's a set method of world making at these workshops, a complicated craft dating back to 1492 when the first known globe was made. Round a solid ball of wood is built up a hollow shell of stiff paper, which is then coated with plaster. Nine separate layers of plaster are applied to a thickness of 1/8 of an inch. Moulding takes about 6 hours, and a fine, smooth surface is imparted to the world in miniature.
I love how everyone's dressed in their best clothes.
Once the globe is set and dried, it passes to another department where the covering map is pasted on. Like restoring the skin to a peeled orange, the colored printed sections exactly cover the surface. But the covering process calls for a keen eye and steady hand. A fraction of an inch out will put the world miles out of joint. The globes come in a large variety of sizes and purposes, from an inch in diameter to 6 feet, and ranging in price from 16 shillings to £1,000. The different types of globe include celestial, political and relief, or slate-colored spheres for use with chalks.
I want one of those.
In keeping with their subject, the globe makers have a world market. 90% are made for export. They're printed in all languages, including Russian, and the majority go to schools. From first to last, the complete job takes 15 hours. A final coat of varnish adds a protective shine. Nearly 100 of the staff have been there for more than 30 years. While the rest of mankind does its best to blow the world up, they like building a new one.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about planetarity. I have to thank my dear friend and fellow scholar, Professor Ed Wall. Ed Wall teaches at the University of Greenwich, and a lot of this work has developed out of conversations over cups of tea or pints of beer with him. And I think it's also kind of interesting to point out that Ed is from the Highlands of Scotland. So it's very difficult to talk about indigeneity in UK context. But the history of the Highlands is one that doesn't lead people to think very kindly towards the British Crown or the Empire. And indeed, there's a generations-long sort of hatred of England and the Crown that's sitting there up north. And for very good reason, because the enclosures that happened in Britain were realized in Scotland as what were called the clearances. People were forcibly removed from the land, dispossessed. The land was destroyed and made over for sheep farming. So the purposes to which that land could put were no longer possible, which meant that there was actually an act of colonialism that happened in Scotland, which is very much like what we can see in the rest of the world. So colonialism happens very, very close to home in the UK. In fact, it also happened in Ireland, and I would recommend Jane Ohlmeyer's book, which is called Making Ireland English. So there is a very, very interesting colonial history, very, very close to the metropole that we can look at. Now, planetarity is a way of thinking and describing the globe, thinking and describing the Earth, thinking and describing our planet, our world. All those different words are really important. And I think also this speaks to the theme of the conference, structures in transition. The way that we think is a structure. It's an epistemology. It's a structure of knowledge that we apply, and structures of knowledge have made the world we live in. So thinking about how we think is a really important part of transforming the world and creating transitions. So that's the kind of thing that I'm going to try to get through. I'll talk first about planetarity. Then I will go on to talk, well, and maybe a little bit about utopias. Then I will go on to talk about double consciousness in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who's been discussed yesterday so eloquently by Teresa. And then I'll talk about landscaping. I know landscape architects don't like to talk about landscaping, but I need to, so I will. So the term planetarity comes from Spivak's work, which is called Imperatives to Reimagine the Planet. So that's what I'm trying to do, and I think that's our job. That's our task. My generation, your generation, that is our job. Let me look back, though, at this video really quickly, because I think that there's some lovely things going on. There's the idea of world making here. Of course, the world that's being made is a cartographic world. It's a hollow sphere that's happening here. So in a way, it's a kind of very reductive sense of world making that's happening. And it's a place where history's always been repeated. That, I think, is really interesting, too, because that talks about a certain concept of history and placemaking, which is replicable. And this is one of the important things about colonialism and empire, is you've got to be able to do the same thing in different places. They all have to look the same and operate the same so that they're comparable and commensurable. So that is something that the cartographic globe has to teach us about the operation of empire. So here, yes, the hollow shell of stiff paper, that's very clear here. And when we conceive of the globe, it's often as a surface. And this is one of the problems of globalization, is that it thinks about the world in a kind of abstract economic way that isn't really, it doesn't have depth. It doesn't reach into the ground. It doesn't have topography. Water doesn't flow through it. Breezes don't flow through it. Tides and currents don't move. It's a way of trying to make the globe sort of static. So this is a map that can just be painted on. And that's reflected in the idea of a world market. And even that we can think of the world solely as a marketplace. And you hear this too in terms of ideas, the marketplace of ideas. If I actually step back and try to think that one through, I can't. I don't know what that is, unless it's these forms of appropriation and data mining and the fact that we're, that's what I think of when I think about the marketplace of ideas, is people mining our ideas. And then this one, wow, the rest of the world. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just apply a nice coat of varnish? Like, okay, climate change, dealt with, coat of varnish. So in the 1950s, that fear of nuclear annihilation, building bunkers, hiding under your desk, all of these things were so present in the public imagination. And I think we have these kind of monsters in our imaginations now. They're very, of course we still have the nuclear threat. Putin's not going away. We still have these kind of problems, but now we also have these other thorny problems of climate change and biodiversity loss and all of these kinds of things. And we've got to find a way to think ourselves through that. We've got to have a kind of efficacy of thinking that allows us to feel like we can just put a coat of varnish on, that we've got a solution. Although solution is another word that I have difficulty with, because landscapes are not problems. Landscapes are processes and forces and relationships that we come into and we transform. They are not necessarily problems. Okay, the obligatory blue marble image. How many talks have you seen with this image? Like hundreds, right? It has an incredible presence in our imagination, and it's an emblem of the environmental movement that became kind of recharged in the 1960s. Unfortunately, What happens when a lot of people point to this image is that they then proceed to kind of propel this myth about the environmental movement having been born with the Earthrise image and with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But that, in fact, is not the case. The idea of the world as a celestial body is something that was, the Romans knew about it. If you look at Roman coinage, the emperor is always shown holding a globe. So there's a sense of dominion over there as well, dominion over the earth rather than care for, which this image kind of gave us. I'm going to move on quickly from this one because it's really firmly lodged in your brains. But we have the Ptolemaic image of the universe, and this is a geocentric universe represented after Ptolemy's time by Bartolomeo Velio. It's a beautiful drawing, and it sees the universe as being kind of nested around the Earth at the center. So this is a different model of planetarity. It's a different way of thinking about the way that the universe operates. This is, perhaps not so useful if you're trying to do celestial observations, although Ptolemy was a very capable astronomer. So things were kind of at odds at this particular time in terms of the way that knowledge was constructed. We're getting much closer to a 20th or 21st century map when we look at Ortelius's atlas from 1570. It's really, to me, quite remarkable how accurate this is. So by 1570, there is already a very good sense of the whole world and of the continents, and indeed of the fact that those continents might have fit together at one point. That is a big puzzle that might have been Pangaea. There's some inaccuracy over on the Oregon side, but you guys weren't around to help correct that at that time. I don't know, does anyone know the work of Élisée Reclus? He's missing from history, and the reason he's missing from history is because he was an anarchist. So anarchists are very carefully kind of scrubbed out of history wherever possible. So the history of regionalism, for example, if we're looking at regionalism and bioregionalism, everyone's like, oh yeah, it started with Patrick Geddes, right? Élisée Reclus was a strong influence on the work of Patrick Geddes. In this case, I would recommend a book by Peter Riley, which is called Making Another World Possible. And Reclus was one of the communards. He was part of the Paris Commune. He escaped the Paris Commune, which is where the working class, for a short period of time, took over the governance of Paris. There was a weakness in power, and they stepped in. And it was this wonderful kind of radical movement. They thought about everything in everyday life as being liberatory. There was a shoemaker who was involved, for example, who made very square shoes that would be more comfortable for your feet. So it was about freeing the body, freeing the mind, and freeing yourself from the strictures of a regicentric state, of the control and compliance that is germane to the state. So Reclus was a great traveler. Really was there at the beginning of sociology and geography. His work underpins that to a great degree. This is the frontispiece and the first chapter of his multi-volume L'Homme et la Terre. The saying there is something I can very much imagine being on my tombstone. L'homme et la nature prenant conscience d'elle-même. Humans are nature becoming conscious of herself. I think that's really lovely because we often talk about the fact that we're part of nature, right? Humans are nature. Yeah, great. But this is that next logical step to say, actually, we are nature coming into consciousness. And what I really like about that is the sense of obligation that comes with that. If we are the consciousness of nature, then our duty of care arises from our consciousness, arises from our ability to sense and make reason of the world around us. So by all means, read the work of Élisée Reclus if you can get your hands on it. There's also a wonderful history of the Paris Commune by Kristen Ross, which is called Communal Luxury. And if you've heard of the idea of fully automated luxury communism, that's kind of the beginning of that sensibility. I bet a lot more of you know this image. Yeah, how many of you know this image? Okay, great. This is going to be really interesting to me. This is work in progress. I like to present my work as it's coming together. And I've been presenting this to European audiences. And one or two people in the audience will know this image. But it really says so much about the operation of American empire, the conquest of the West, and about processes of genocide and ecocide that were at the heart of American nation-making processes, at the heart of American world-making processes, and continue to be. So, who is she? She does have a name. Oh, you've seen it, but you don't know her name. That is Columbia, the same Columbia that's in the District of Columbia. She's a female goddess-like personification of the idea of America. So she's emblematic. She's obviously perfect because she's abstract. Although it must not have felt abstract when they pinned her toga right to her flesh. That just looks uncomfortable. So there's a lot to unpack from this. Has anyone really unpacked this image for you? Okay, so some of you. So what's happening is you have the light of civilization on this side. And this is also God's light, right? Because God shines on white people. And the darkness is being pushed away by Columbia's progress. So her progress is physical and spatial. Columbia's progress is taking place in the landscape and can be read as landscape forces. She is bringing with her transportation. She's bringing with her telecommunications. So these are telegraph wires she's holding. Nowadays she'd be holding a smartphone, and she'd have it open to Twitter. What else is happening? You do have some settlers here in the Midwest who've already staked a claim, who brought the idea of property, of private property, and the fact that you can stake a claim on a particular piece of land, and even if you're not using it, continue to own it. Crazy idea. You've got the stagecoach, all these forms of transportation. You've got mining and exploration, and of course, lots of shooting. There's a great deal of that, and forgive me, I know this is a triggering image in many, many ways. And what's happening in the darkness is that the Native American people and the bison, who are so fundamental to the way of life, the plains are being plowed up, which are a source of sustenance. The bison are all being killed on purpose because they're a source of sustenance. You can see this bear snarling and leaving the picture. This guy, I always think of him as, he's like, bastards. But you also have the skeletons of the dead bison in the image as well. Columbia herself is wearing the Star of Empire in her hair, and she's carrying, if you look very carefully, she's carrying a school book. And I think that's really interesting too, to think about the place of educational institutions and how they need to be transformed but it's also, I think, illustrative of the difference between being schooled and being educated, right? If someone's being schooled, that's not nice, right? Ooh, I was just schooled. And that I think is part of the sense here that there's a world-building exercise that's taking place, and it requires a particular type of knowledge that needs to be beaten into people's skulls. What else to say about this? The last thing I think is really interesting about this is that the city we get. Anyone want to guess what that city is? The one in the, right there. New York. Yeah. So that's Manhattan coming down there. And this is 1872. And the Brooklyn Bridge wasn't finished yet. In fact, it had only just been begun. So there's actually a little bit of prophecy happening in this as well. He's pictured the Brooklyn Bridge completed, and it becomes this kind of beacon of empire for the whole of the country. So that the place that New York already has in the national imagination is huge here. But he's also building that image because John Gast is actually from Brooklyn. So he's kind of like, got to make sure I get the Brooklyn Bridge in there. And it does really, I think, still occupy that kind of space in the imagination. The last thing I'd say is interesting is that this is in the Autry Museum of the American West, and probably everyone's forgotten who Gene Autry was. Anybody know who Gene Autry was? Yeah, a couple of you sort of. He was an incredibly famous singer and entertainer. He was the singing cowboy. Weirdly, he was also famous for his Christmas music. So he wrote Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But I think that's interesting too, because when you think about how Christmas and Santa Claus and all this kind of stuff requires a mythologizing apparatus, the way in which songs and images and such were all incorporated into a vision of what the West needed to become is really, really interesting. The other thing that I think about Autry that's interesting is he created something called the Cowboy Code, right, which is all about being gallant to women and things like that. But also, like number 7 is don't be racist, which is not necessarily what you expect. So I kind of have a tiny little soft spot for the singing cowboy. That image of world making and of landscape making is something, again, that goes right to the heart of empire and to Thomas Jefferson and Monticello, to the University of Virginia and its library at the center of this utopian city on a hill of learning, which becomes embedded in the American psyche and which is visible in your little utopia here in Eugene. And what is a university campus if not a utopian ideal? It's a whole concept about how disciplines and ideas relate to one another in space. And it's an idea about what we want for the future. So there's a lot of utopia built into the ideal of the university. Here though, there's the dark dystopia is lurking just behind, as it so often is, because the slave quarters are to the rear. And this landscape is not a landscape that indigenous peoples could live in. This is a world that's been remade in a European image, and indigenous peoples didn't have the operating manual, which is part of the whole process of dispossession. Destroy the environment and the people so that there's no going back. And there are other places in the world where we see that happening right now. In this case, though, there's a kind of positive negative thing going on, because the plantation is colonialism. And at this time, plantation and colonialism were actually synonymous. You could talk about the plantation of the New World, and you meant colonialism. And it's very much visible here. So here are, these are Jefferson's grandchildren, looking like the twins from The Shining. I know that's only a coincidence. But in the background of the image, the trees you can see just here, any guesses what those might be? No, really common agricultural tree used as a windbreak. I think they're probably Lombardy poplars. So Populus nigra, European tree, imported to the United States and used everywhere. And they had, in 1825, they'd only just been introduced. They were new. So Jefferson was like, hey, I'm trying out these trees. You ought to have some. So that process of plantation is being demonstrated here. So this is doing all that taste-making stuff that Martha Stewart does. You know, it really is projecting a sensibility and saying this is how America shall be built. And Jefferson was very much aware of that when he was talking about the gentleman farmer and all of that kind of thing. And you can look around as well. Like, it's really hard to tell what these are, but I'll bet you anything they're English roses. They just don't happen to be in bloom at the moment, just the way they're planted. And then this is, I think that's probably verbascum. That's mullein, again, another European introduction. So this image, this rather bad, naive image by a friend of the Jefferson family, is really doing a lot of signifying and a lot of signaling. And that kind of thing continues to this day. I had to start, so you guys know, this is in your neighborhood. And I was just like, wow. Because it is totally plantation colonialism that's going on in this architecture. I almost wanted to look around the back to see if the slave quarters were there. But of course, what we're looking at is the operation of a financial structure that configures the world in so many ways. So actually, maybe there's not a slave quarters there literally, but figuratively, there is all sorts of expropriation, dispossession, and human misery embodied in that facade, you know, kind of cleaned up by that facade. So when you pass it, do as the Native Americans did to Columbia and give it the finger. Bank of America. Okay, so that is the end of the slideshow, and I'm just going to talk at you. So you've looked at a lot of slides. So there we go. Look at that, a soothing blank screen. And I have a couple of quotes I want to read to you. One of them is from Barbara Bender, who was formerly at University College London. And she writes, in her introduction to landscapes, politics, and perspectives, great landscape thinker, Barbara Bender, sums up some of the issues that I've been grappling with. She says, operating at the juncture of history and politics, social relations and cultural perceptions, landscape has to be a concept of high tension. I think for people outside of landscape, that's a really weird thing to hear. Because landscape is soothing, right? It's the garden. It's where you go to hear the birds chirp and listen to the water flow. Landscape as a concept of high tension talks about the fact that land and land relations are the most fraught elements of human life. Richard Sennett points out that the word law derives from a Norse root, ligja, which describes the fact that law lies upon the land. Law and the operation of law is something that is necessarily earthbound and that necessarily can be read through landscape relations. So I think, you know, and what could be more political than law? What could be more political than land? So landscape is necessarily a concept of high tension. Landscape is also often thought about as scenography, like, you know, a picture, a landscape. But that is, of course, an important element of it. The pictures that we make of landscape make landscapes. There's been a reciprocal relationship between painting and landscape throughout the history of especially European art, but certainly also of Chinese and Japanese art and all others, that we make ideal images of places and then attempt to realize them on Earth. And then we make images of those idealized places and make even more idealized places. So this kind of loop goes back and forth between art and landscape that is kind of constantly magnifying. So when you look out at the American landscape, at these, strange kind of suburban houses with their lawns and such, that's an ever magnifying relationship or loop between expectations that are brought about through scenography. But they don't reflect the relationships that really happen on land with the climate, with the waters, with the specific soils of places and topography, which shape language and shape us in ways that are very specific. So I'll come back to that a little bit when I talk about double consciousness, because we have an abstract ideal of landscape and a lived landscape that are operating simultaneously and which are in conflict with one another, but which necessarily coexist and somehow hang together despite their incommensurability. So landscape has to be something that blows apart the boundaries between the disciplines as well. So it's not just high tension, but it's explosive. When you start insisting upon landscape relations and not pulling them apart, you're insisting upon forms of interdisciplinarity that universities and such really don't want to do. And here's where the utopianism comes in. My dear friend Tom Moylan, who has really a seminal book in utopian studies, which is called Demand the Impossible, writes about the importance of utopias for social movements and writes about the importance of utopias in science fiction and the way that they change the world through making new images of possible worlds. And he writes about the critical utopia. So the critical utopia operates in the Enlightenment sense of critique, that it's making a critique of the world by placing us just slightly outside of the world so we can look back at it with a certain amount of critical distance. But he also says that in terms of activism and the ability to change the world, that critical sense is also the nuclear sense of critical mass. It has the sense to move the world, to ignite something. So I think that's also really, really important to think about the image making, the storytelling that we do, again, which Teresa spoke so eloquently about, and about the importance of doing that and continuing to do that. So ideas of utopia and ideas of landscape are dangerous, and that's a good thing. Let me come back to planetarity, because this is something that I was really grappling with as I was trying to bring this work together, and I'm still, this is going to be a book, but it's not book-shaped yet. So I will be very curious to hear your responses to it too. So I welcome your critiques, nuclear or otherwise, and I'm really happy to hear them, because it is certainly possible for me to be wrong or to be redirected. So Dennis Cosgrove, the geographer, he says that there are 3 different frames for thinking about the Earth, which I think that planetarity kind of pulls them all together underneath it. And when I began to do this work, I was mad at the global. I was angry. I wanted to like kill off this cartographic idea of Earth. But my ideas have changed a little bit. So let me explain a little bit more. So if we think about, well, let me read to you from Cosgrove. So Earth, world, and globe, used interchangeably, each has a distinct resonance. Earth is organic. The word denotes rootedness, nurture, and dwelling for living things. It also implies attachment and habitation. So actually, if I call myself an earthling, there's, it's funny, but it's also, it does kind of denote a person or being that is very much connected to the earth and to the soil. In contrast to earth, world has more of a social and spatial meaning. The world implies cognition and agency. Consciousness alone can constitute the world. Humans go into the world. They may become worldly. They create life worlds or worlds of ideas, worlds of meaning. So this is really far from abstract in many ways. And Donna Haraway speaks about worlding. She doesn't talk about world making or world building. And she goes further to say it matters what worlds. And I know that's a very strange way of putting words together, but the worlds in your head have the capacity to make new worlds, and that process is something that Haraway calls worlding. And I don't think it's necessarily something we do inside our own heads. I think it's something we do collectively. When you look at the way that colonialism and this idea of the new world was being trotted out across the space of the United States of America, it's very clear that nobody had written like one rule book for that. It was a collective endeavor that had a lot of different inflections and yet somehow all hung together to change the look, feel, and operation of the world for better or worse. So then Cosgrove goes on he talks about globe. He says, neither earth nor world denotes the spatiality of globe. Globe associates the planet with the abstract form of spherical geometry. So that's that hollow sphere. Emphasizing volume and surface over material constitution or territorial organization. Unlike the earth and the world, the globe is distantiated as a concept and image rather than directly touched and experienced. So it's really different from that earthliness or worldliness, which is necessarily spatial in a very sensory way. As a globe, the planet is geometrically constructed, its contingency reduced to a surface pattern of lines and shapes. Thus, the globe is visual and graphic rather than experiential or textual. Julian Thomas calls this land appropriated by the disengaged look. And I think it is possible to be vehemently anti-globe. My mentor, Kenneth Olwig, has an essay called "The Earth is Not a Globe," right? Like he's really angry about it, and it's a polemic that says, don't you dare call my beautiful Earth a globe. But there is actually a romantic sensibility of global space, a poetic idea of global space, which I don't think can be discarded. So elsewhere in my work, I talk about insurgency as an idea for transformation of the world, and that it operates differently from revolution. Revolution is where you overturn everything and remake everything from the beginning. But there's so much in the world around us that we love and value that may even have been created by negative forces like imperialism, like colonialism, like Art Deco movie theaters are an icon of capitalism, right? But who doesn't love an Art Deco movie theater? You wouldn't want to sweep those aside in your pursuit of revolution. So insurgency is about holding the things we hold dear together while transforming them from the inside, but doing so as an insurgency, as a surging up within, right? So it still has strength, it still has force, but it doesn't force us to discard those things that we love. So the image of a unified globe is something also that globalism gives us. The idea that we're all in it together, that we share that space together, that we share an intellectual and imaginary space as humans, as a species that inhabits a planet. That is a very important and valuable aspect of globalism that shouldn't be discarded. So this is tricky. And again, I'm really eager to hear your ideas on this as well. So planetarity, then, I am proposing as a kind of umbrella term that holds together for us usefully all of our ideas about the world, worldliness, earthliness, globality, and the idea that our existences are planetary, so we exist within the cosmos. I guess one last thing I'll say about worlding is that there's another concept called paracosms. And the paracosm is more of a kind of, it's a term from literature. And a paracosmic world is something that often happens in childhood, where a child will kind of make up a whole world for themselves to inhabit, but it also can be a literary world, like Tolkien's Middle-earth, for example, which has its own languages, which is fully elaborated. It's not a utopia. It's not, kind of proposing a better or perfect world, but it is a fully elaborated mental world. Even those kind of worlds actually have the possibility to shift the way that we think, because we use metaphors now from Middle-earth, trolls and what have you, in a kind of Middle-earthian way to describe the world around us. So the disconnect between the abstract global world and the way that forces of power landscape the world for us to inhabit is at complete odds with the way that we live in real landscapes, responding to weather and soil and topography. And I think this is very much like double consciousness, that we live in an imaginary world in many ways that's been partially realized, that's a kind of fantasy of the world that doesn't fit the physical geographic world that we actually inhabit. And I think it's useful to compare that to Du Bois's double consciousness, which talks about what it is to live as a black person in a white world, and to have to look out through kind of two sets of eyes. So this is a really, really famous quote from Du Bois. He says, "Black Americans are born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." And I think that landscapes are lived in similar ways. They're the stage setting of earthly power and the stage setting of a particular world order that actually most of us live every day despite that landscape. So that, I think, connects interestingly to the notion of hybridity, about being a hybrid being. I should say also that there are notions of like triple consciousness, like what is it to be black and queer, looking out through three different sets of eyes at the world. And C.L.R. James felt that this hybridity, this doubleness, was a tool of imperialism, right? It was something that C.L.R. James was striving for purity of identity. But Linda Tuhiwai Smith, in her Decolonizing Methodologies, which is a really important book, and if you don't know it and you're just beginning a research process, I definitely recommend you look at it. She's the one who says that research is a dirty word. Very useful to start a process of research realizing it might do harm, or actually indeed that it's likely to do harm, and how to steer around that is very useful. But Homi Bhabha, in his book, The Location of Culture, he argues that hybridity is actually a tool. It allows us to subvert dominant paradigms and work within them in a way that I would say is kind of insurgent, like rising up within it and transforming it from inside. And Jill Kased, again, someone whose work I think is absolutely fabulous. She has a book called Sowing Empire, which talks about the processes of plantation in the New World and the way that they transformed the space of that world. New World, there it is again, that idea of world making. So she speaks about the West Indies and the way that they're transformed, and all of the things that we associate with the West Indies aren't real. They were all sort of transplanted into that place. So she says, the plantation in the West Indies and the process of disindiginating, what a word, transplanting and re-landscaping. She says that land was made empty and then repossessed by its ostentatious cultivation. This is the ostentatious cultivation that transformed the West Indies from a place, a lived indigenous place, into an island paradise. So she says not only, and this is amazing how much goes on here, not only were the main cash crops of the plantation system sugarcane, coffee, and indigo. Look, okay, you're wearing blue jeans and you're having an iced latte, and boy, are you participating in colonialism. These are transplants, but plant transfers from the Caribbean, from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the South Pacifics, which racially transformed the landscapes of the Caribbean islands, that those species of flora most symbolically associated with the tropics were precisely those plants by which the British grafted one idea of island paradise onto another. Bamboo, logwood, cashew, casuarina, royal palm, immortelle, coconut palm, citrus, mango, tamarind, breadfruit, banana, bougainvillea, hibiscus, oleander, poinsettia, Thunbergia, and even pasture grass, which was guinea grass from West Africa, were all colonial transplants. So landscaping is important. And the general claim of this study and my work is to say that landscaping should be understood as a united material and imaginary set of discourses and practices which continues to shape the world that we imagine. Now, how do we get out of this? Where do we go from here? We've heard a lot in the last couple of days. I think ideas that I hear echoed around the world. So these aren't new ideas that the speakers have brought into the room. They're the air we breathe at the moment. They're the ideas that are in the world. And one thing that we are all definitely trapped by is the ideas of our time. We live within the ideas of our time, and we're pushing those ideas forward. But the insurgency is already well underway, right? Those ideas are really working well, and none of the speakers knew each other before they came here, and yet we're all working on the same project. It is holding together as a unified system of discursive and practical system, which is making pictures of itself, which is romanticizing itself, which is making songs about itself. We do have a new way of being in the world that we just need to keep doing, rather than to invent it all for ourselves. So Achille Mbembe, whose work Necropolitics, I think says so much to the current condition and to the dying days of capitalism and imperialism as we know it. We are in the middle of the end of capitalism, for sure. And it's just whether we help it to die a kind of quiet death as it's transformed is really important. So I guess what I'll say, just to wrap up, is that whole worlds were transformed by a utopian imagination, which was driven by colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and they were all propagated through acts of imagination and work in various ways, and that these processes of world making are incremental and that they all kind of hang together. So if we have a job to do as humans, as a human species, as the species that is nature becoming conscious of itself, Our job on Earth, our obligation is just to be better humans on the Earth. And this is something that we can do and picture together, and is something that we are already doing. And all of that gives me hope that this kind of utopian imagination is something that we all build together and that will transform the world. So, thank you. I had to end on a positive note after 2 days, didn't I?
Hello. Tim, thank you so much for that presentation. Honestly, just speaking as a student, it's very great to have you here, and I'm really glad that you've brought some of these topics to the table. So thank you so much. And can I do one more round of applause for Tim? So now I think we're about to transition into the Q&A portion, if I'm right. And so I'm going to open up the table for discussion, but I just wanted to begin with a question for you. So we have a group of designers in this room. I'm assuming many of you are in architecture school or otherwise are joining visitors. And I'm curious, in your opinion, as architects, I feel like we tend to perpetuate a settler colonial narrative on accident. We enter a place, we study it, we research it, and then we apply an architecture to it that is inherently informed by our own bias. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think when you think architects should stop and no longer be the architect, and then let people in their own communities build on their own.
Ooh. I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the circumstance. If you are designing for a small rural community, it's very different from designing for Hudson Yards in New York. So, obviously, we're not going to remake capitalism overnight, and so a lot of you are going to go out into practice doing stuff that directly ties in with these systems of global finance and real estate and that kind of thing. David Harvey talks about insurgent architecture and the way that actually we can slowly work within systems of architecture to transform. And I think that is happening, that we're looking at ways that we can make buildings greener. We're looking at ways that we can, make concrete eat carbon and stuff like that. I think that is all laudable. The architect and landscape architect and planner, I don't think have the ability to abandon their future visioning role. That is fundamentally what we do. We are communicators about possible futures. We are able to help people visualize future worlds, future buildings, future landscapes. And our job is also to kind of guide that, because a lot of people don't really know what they want and don't know what the possibilities are. So there is a certain hubris that we take into the world with us that goes with our very important spectacles and the foulards we toss over our shoulders and the way we enter a room. Being in design is a persona. So I don't think transforming that is necessary, but transforming our relationships there is, we need to act with humility. We need to listen to people and not give them what we think they need, but help them to achieve something that comes from their imaginings of a better future, but that we say, you could also have this, and this, and this, and this. So don't stop wearing fancy footwear, and don't stop wearing important spectacles, and don't stop entering a room with confidence, because that's all part of the show. That's what helps people to understand that you're there in a special moment of transformation. So the performance is important.
Thank you so much. And just to add 2 small cents, but selfishly I won't ramble on, I've heard architects described as salespeople, but also as therapists. And so I feel like what I'm hearing from you is maybe the therapy front of things. But yeah, so now on this stage, I'd like to open up the floor to the audience and to see if you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask him.
Thank you. I'm really interested in your sort of visual analysis of artworks and representation. I think maybe you call them imaginations, but I think of them as like artistic representations. And the feedback between describing the landscape and then the representation generating a new one. And that seems to be mostly about the effect or the description of the artwork or the representation, but not about the process necessarily, or like the type of representation. And I was wondering if you have an opinion about like, is there something inherently colonial about a landscape painting, about as a type, or about the process of creating one, rather than just the effect or the description, and how that might fit into your idea of generating new imaginations?
Okay, yeah. You guys are asking me wonderfully difficult questions, but that's great. That's exactly what I want. Representation, like agency, is about a standing in for. So when we perform acts of representation, we're making a drawing that stands in for something that's actually in real life, or we make a model that represents something that's actually larger. But also to be a representative is like I'm empowered to walk into a room and speak on your behalf. So I think it kind of connects to the question of how we speak and work with communities too. Who is being represented? Who is being spoken for? So there are questions here that are more than human as well, which we saw wonderfully in the discussion this morning about what is the agency of the camas bulb, what is the agency of the meadow, and we often think about the more than human. I mean, the students who want to write about the more than human always come to me talking about animals and plants. But the more than human is also about associations and things that kind of hang together. So an institution is more than human. A university is more than human. The works that we do together are more than human. So there is some work to do to expand what the more than human imagination is in order to think about what we're representing. So the more utopian and large scale your imaginings are, the better able you'll be to kind of incorporate within your representations everything that's necessary to think through, like not driving metal stakes into a these things are really important, but they're hard to imagine alone, and they're hard to imagine without the support of drawings and without discussions as well. So to think of ourselves as architects and landscape architects who are embroiled in processes and trying to draw, write, and speak our way out of these situations to transform them. Agency is the other word that's really important, is that we give agency to things around us. Things have agency. Things in the natural world have agency to transform our lives, and again, that's like representation. That they are being spoken for in one way or another, and hearing those voices is an important part of the design process. That it's a really radical openness to the world that's necessary. And then I guess finally, you talked about image making, about scenography, and I think that's something that's really fundamentally human. We just do that. So there's nothing capitalist about a landscape painting intrinsically. So I think the tools that we have for representation can be used for good or ill, and they are relatively neutral in terms of how we use them. There's a beautiful book by Ellen Dissanayake, which is called Homo Aestheticus. And she talks about the art function. And what she comes to after a lot of philosophical discussion is that she says that the art function is making special. That it helps to take things out of the realm of the ordinary and place them in the realm of the extraordinary. which I think is a nice way of thinking about how architecture and landscape work as well. And perhaps again back to that question of giving a community not just what they want, but actually what they couldn't imagine, and giving them something that's special in addition to something that satisfies their basic needs. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Looks like we have a question up front.
Hello, thank you again for being here. Can you give us any insight into your design process? And also, do you have a land practice? And what does that mean to you?
Wow, okay, my design process. I don't do a lot of designing these days other than designing books. And it is still, and designing presentations and things like that. When I ask students to think about design process, and I used to do assignments where I asked students to like inhabit the process of an artist, like think about everything they do in their lives. I think design process starts with like how you get up in the morning and how many cups of coffee you have and how you greet your day and whether you have a walk, and like honestly, because your body is a sensing organism, and how you treat your body also helps you to approach your work. So preparing the body and the mind simultaneously to enter into the creative process is a really involved thing. In the East they would call it mindfulness, I guess, just to be aware of who you are in the world and how you approach your work. But then probably the most important thing is that I don't necessarily separate analysis and evaluation and design. They are different processes. They require different parts of the brain. But if you try to start with purely analysis and evaluation, and those are two very different things, right? To talk about the physical things that are there that can be enumerated is evaluation, right? I can graph that, I can chart that. Evaluation is thinking about what things mean to people and what values they hold there. So we often talk about needs, wants, and expectations when we address design projects. Needs are fundamental, right? You need a roof over your head, you need food. You need sex, actually. So pleasure is actually a need as well. I would put that in the needs camp. Wants are things that would be nice to have but aren't necessary. And then expectations, we don't spend that much time talking about expectations, but those are the hardest things because a lot of those are hardwired. Like you might expect to have a car, you might expect to use roads, you might, those aren't necessities. But people feel they can't do without such things. Some expectations are about privilege, I'm a white guy, I need to occupy this kind of place in the world. So expectations are where a lot of tensions lie as well. So managing expectations is important as part of the process. I got diverted here. But moving back and forth between analysis and evaluation and design is really important too. I think as designers, you can't walk down the street without going, oh, I would have done that differently. So don't suppress those impulses until you're done with the analysis and evaluation. Go with it. Start saying, I think this needs to happen, because your analysis and evaluation will confirm whether those moves are good and whether you might go with them or whether you might reevaluate them. So by all means, start designing. And I guess the other thing that I think is really important is that when I was a student, we did have that kind of separation, like, okay, now you do your analysis and now we'll go into the design phase. And students were always asked, what's your concept? Are you still asked that? Yeah? Apologies to anyone who's teaching and who asks that of their students, but I think it's terrible. I think it's a terrible thing to ask, because it's asking you to bring your ideas together in one legible kind of move, like it's a nautilus shell, or it's a flower. That doesn't help the design process at all, and it actually it causes a kind of design constipation. You can't move past it. you are stuck at that point, and that's what we call analysis paralysis. So that what is your concept question is actually what you get to at the end of the design. The concept is the way you package up a design to explain it to the client. So that's when you trot out the Nautilus shell, and but at the point of design, I think you are really trying, especially in landscape, you are trying to come to terms with designing for the relationships that you encounter on the site, and to transform them for the better. And that, I think to a lot of people of the kind of modernist persuasion, that doesn't feel like the hot light of invention, which is what we're all supposed to do, right? It's new, no one's ever seen it before. New forms arise within old circumstances, and will continue to do so. So I think transforming the world for the better is much better than like plopping something fancy in the middle of it. Of course, the image that comes to mind immediately is Heatherwick's wastebasket in Hudson Yards, the vessel, which a friend of mine has described as ableism, the building. And that to me, that's just an act of needless aggression. It's a stupid, meaningless thing that is pure concept that's just plopped in the middle of the site. It's a toy, essentially. It should never be bigger than what you could fit in your hand. So that is, kind of concept-driven, contextless, bad design, poster child. That one. I work just a few steps away from Heatherwick's office. And just like that fleeing Native American, I'm always like, yeah, I have an axe to grind, can you tell?
Hey, Tim, thanks for your talk. I'm curious, your speech, your presentation gives a lot of sort of, I guess, more abstract meanings for architects. I'm curious for you, the utopian architect. What does that look like for you? Is the architect of the future, or the utopian architect, is it someone who has done the work? Are they a leader? Are they taking what they know from history and saying, this is the better idea, let me guide you and create this system? Or is it someone who is synthesizing everything that's come before them and kind of creating a system from that? I'm just curious your thoughts.
The utopian impulse is often nowadays countered by something that utopian scholars call anti-utopianism, I guess an example is when Barack Obama said, we've got to have hope and we're going to transform the world, and basically the naysayers on the right were like, that's just utopian. The world is a bad place, and it's what we live in, and just suck it up, dude. So anti-utopianism is something that's actually kind of built into neoliberalism and capitalism, which says you're not allowed to think outside the box. What you see is what you get. And one of Margaret Thatcher's campaign slogans was actually, they called her Tina, there is no alternative. There is no alternative to economic liberalism, so suck it up, this is all you get. And that's a kind of anti-utopian force. And it's been kind of easy for those type of people to demonize the totalizing utopia makers of the modernist era when so many of those experiments went wrong. We look at Pruitt-Igoe. I mean, that went wrong for a lot of reasons other than, just there's a very good documentary about Pruitt-Igoe, which is on canopy.com if you have access to that. But I think the important thing and is to think about utopia not as a goal necessarily, but as a method, as a way of reimagining outside of current possibilities. So it doesn't have to arrive at a perfect form, but it does have to demand something impossible in the process. It does have to kind of move us beyond our expectations and beyond. Henri Lefebvre writes about utopianism as just being driven by dissatisfaction with the way things are. So it really is a kind of very simple impulse. And understanding it and using it well is a way of taking control of those processes of transformation. But it's best not to expect that that's all going to arrive all at once in one perfect world. Yeah.
So I've been thinking about this question for a while, and you're probably the person I want to ask it to. So if we manifest our imaginaries, is dystopic thinking dangerous? Like, do we go into a loop where we accept ecological collapse, where we accept the future of murderous artificial intelligences, where we accept the surveillance state's supremacy by allowing and encouraging dystopic media? You know, I feel like there's a lot more dystopic film and representation than there is utopic film and representation. So is dystopic thinking potentially dangerous? Are we manifesting this negative future?
Dystopianism really kind of came into its own after the Second World War and into the 1970s in particular. There was a way of writing dystopias that became common at that point. In a way, imagining perfectly terrible worlds. And I, to some degree, that was driven by reality. You know, just the way in which Americans saw Vietnam, for example, as this, cataclysm, is something that you almost have to imagine as a kind of perfectly terrible world. And the threat of nuclear annihilation as well has to be imagined as a perfectly terrible world. But I think that form of imagination is just as necessary as the imagining of better worlds, because it helps us to see those worlds more clearly, and it also helps us to see that they're driven by imaginaries as much as good possible worlds. And of course, Margaret Atwood's work is really the one that is like a beacon nowadays, because it's awfully prophetic. You know, the kind of control over women's bodies that the right is attempting in America now is just unimaginable. You know, who could have imagined that everything that people fought for through the 1960s and 70s would come back to this? But I do think that, that dystopian imaginary, like imagining how bad things can possibly be, is actually keeping the burner on. It's like keeping the heat lit under activist movements to say, I don't want to go there. We don't want to go any further. So it is a motivating factor. It's just that the darkness is so all-consuming. If it is really easy to get to a point where where defeatism takes over, and you're like, oh, we are fucked. And that's not true. And I think the example of the American Progress painting is a really good one to look back to and think, okay, even if the worst case scenario is true, which it probably is, that we are living through an apocalypse, the possibility of living through an apocalypse is presented to us by the experience of indigenous Americans, which means that not only do they show us that you can survive it, and survive it with some measure of your culture intact, but that there's hope to rebuild. And I also think that what we're seeing at the moment is a real backlash against a sense in the right that the world is definitively changing at the moment. again, I would say the talks that you've seen here over the weekend demonstrate that there's a whole new structure of thinking, that these structures are in transition, as your tagline says, and that's really scary for people who've got skin in the game with the system as it is. So we need dystopianism, we need utopianism, we also need a lot of good, hard, pragmatic thinking about how we project future imaginaries together and how we become propagandists, which is another thing that was insisted upon today. You are all propagandists. You are all here to argue for a better world. It is your duty as a human seeking to become part of a better species to argue for a better world and to make the case for it and to make the images that put it across. So don't give up.
Hi, Tim, thank you so much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. A lot of thought-provoking ideas that you shared with us. It made me think about when I was doing my research in my dissertation, because I had not really considered space as being something as important to what I was working on, other than, I'm thinking back to this book about how the colonial spaces were organized to create structures of race, right? Infrastructures of race. This part of the city is for these people, and this part of the city is for these people. So in my research, you can't ignore Derrida, right, and deconstruction. And so I was looking to trace back to where he began, where his thought process began, and creating the deconstruction models that we perpetuate. Mm-hmm. And I thought, how interesting, sitting here, that it was in a book about a conference about the spatial arts, and they had invited Derrida to talk about how his process of deconstruction could be applied to, even though he never had worked in that, but how could it be imported into spatial arts and considerations of space and that. And I thought it was fascinating that he brought up two things. He talked about how the origin of his deconstruction is the thought of a virus that disrupts. And so that disruption occurs in the communication and the discourse. And so I'm thinking about, what you were saying about how power, empire, and how we want to try and dismantle that, or we're working to assert our we're propagandists, and we're fighting for the future of the planet and for a life that's dignified for our descendants, right? And so my dissertation is about disruption through viral metaphors or contagious metaphors that affect the minds of people, and then that is done through resistance and insurgence and shock, in a sense, by disrupting communication, disrupting the discourse to get people to think. And so I was sitting here thinking about how do we send a message, right? If we got everyone agreed to just suddenly one day say we're not going to spend any money for a month, right? We're just going to not spend any money. No money is going to flow in the country. That would be a huge disruption that would call attention to all these overlords that you mentioned before, to think about that. But yet at the same time, people are afraid of what the consequences of something like that might produce for us. We don't want to let go of the comforts that we have, perhaps, by saying, we're not going to do this. But I'm not sure where this all kind of fits in with what you were talking about, but it just brought all these things back to me, and thinking about how the connection of how can design and analysis and evaluation, those things that you were mentioning before and answering to her, can that be a form of disruption to bring about a change in the way that we inhabit space, that we're in the world, and how we can, flows that flow to a certain way to, say, the coloniality, and then reinscribing the power structure, where design can be used to disrupt that and channel it in a different direction. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not forming the question fully, but I just wanted to share.
But you've given me a few things I can kind of grab onto. Mark Johnson and George Lakoff, who wrote Metaphors We Live By, and really talk about human cognition. And I mean, I kind of have spoken about that, about cognition and consciousness, and the importance of thinking through who we are as sensing organisms and the way the body inhabits the world. And one of the things that Johnson and Lakoff do is they say that all our metaphors are spatial. Absolutely all of them. And a virus is also a spatial metaphor, because we cannot perceive of a virus, well, I mean, we can perceive of it as like a little particle, but we perceive of its spatial impacts. And we perceive of how it works in space. So I mean, I think that's important to understand how metaphors help to shape the space and vice versa. There's a dialogue between metaphor and space in the same way that there's a dialogue between landscape and scenography. Then I guess to go a little bit outside of Derrida, Michel de Certeau talks about what he calls the speech act of walking, and you know, Derrida was talking about grammatology, about a grammar of space and of inhabitation, to put it very simply, to oversimplify, forgive me. But in the speech act of walking, what de Certeau is saying is that there is a grammar of spaces that we inhabit, that there's there are, you know, sentences and paragraphs being written by city blocks and by agricultural fields, and when we walk through them, we speak them. So there is a way you walk down the street, which is very different from the way you would walk down a lane in an agricultural landscape. But there's also a different way of walking them. You can inhabit these spaces differently, right? You can walk down the street kind of slangily, right? You can, you know, are you slouching down the street, or are you, you know, what is the manner in which you're walking down the street? And each one of those has a kind of political resonance as well. The French working class, for example, and this is oh my goodness, name's gone out of my head. Wrote Distinction, sociologist, very famous sociologist. Anyway, he writes about the fact that the French working class is very self-possessed and knows it has a place in the world. So a working class person in France walks down the center of the sidewalk and is assured of their place in the world. And that's a political statement. I am working class, but I am here. You're not getting rid of me. Whereas in other countries, I think England, you know, a working class person might walk with their hands in their pockets and like closer to the wall, so that they're occupying less space and they're expressing a different political ideal about themselves in space. I do write about this. I've got an essay called Publicity and Propriety, which talks about the way we hold our bodies in space and the way that expresses an idea. But I think it's not just about how the individual operates in the world. The Occupy movement said, I'm going to use urban space in a way that is unprecedented. I'm going to clog it up so that you can't move through it. And then I'm not here with a list of demands. I'm going to live in this space in a way that shows you a better possible future. So that's what the Occupy movement did. It's you know, it wasn't like, here's my list of demands. It was just saying, watch me live better. Which of course the media just could not. Like, it had no tools for understanding that at all, which is great, right? So the Occupy movement took the media into an impossible realm. So this is totally utopian. It demanded the impossible of a world that was not ready to enter into that space. And actually, I think we're probably still not ready to inhabit that space. But when people say, oh, Occupy failed, that's totally wrong. Occupy was a resounding success, because the kinds of changes in consciousness and sensibility that arose from that have transformed the way it is possible to move in and occupy the world, and how to use its grammars and how to speak space by occupying them. So it's a win.
Check for time real quick. Are we good on time? Just to shift the conversation just a little bit out of the generalized utopian narrative, I'm curious, this might be somewhat selfish, but in your research, you at one point described the colonial utopian narrative as being heteronormative. So I'm curious, in your opinion, where the queer narrative and the queer utopia plays into that, and how you describe that, and would you also describe that as still being colonial, or is it inherently anti-colonial?
Yeah, this is definitely a tough one, because I don't think there's a unifying queer narrative. There's no, you can't point at something over there which is queer. Queerness is transversality. Like, okay, so that's in the word, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick does a really good job of deconstructing that. So the word queer, like, literally means across or athwart, right? So you're running against the mainstream. So that's the unifying image for queerness. Is it just ain't the mainstream, and it's actually across it. It's kind of blocking it a little bit. And when I teach about queerness with my students, all of them feel a little bit queer. There's something that's not normal about everybody. So I am definitely of the camp that says you can have it. Queerness is yours if you want it. If you feel like you don't quite fit, you don't have to like the same sex. You might just feel uncomfortable in social situations. But that can also be queer, which allows you to take that space of critical distance, which allows you to take the space outside of the norm and to look back at it and critique it. So queerness is actually fundamentally a utopian position. It is fundamentally demanding the impossible. And I really take ownership of the term queer, because that's who I am. When I look around at what it is to be gay now, I don't see myself there. I don't see myself in the gay space. Because even though, and my husband is here, but I've never believed in gay marriage, right? I believe in a transformation of human relations. I don't think insisting upon the same thing that straight people has is going to transform the world. I think it is about insisting upon something completely different for everyone. And queerness allows that sort of space. So there is this homonormative sense of gayness which rubs me the wrong way, and I can't find myself there, certainly. What else to say about queerness? The Journal for Utopian Studies has a call out at the moment for works honoring the memory of Jose Esteban Munoz. And if you haven't encountered the work of Munoz, he has a book called Cruising Utopia, which is a wonderful piece of utopian literature, and it talks about how queerness operates in performance, in literature. It's a work of cultural studies, and it's really beautiful. So I think he's right up there with Jack Halberstam for like a really marvelously transformative utopian queer vision. Yeah, so Cruising Utopia. I'm going to run out of...
Thank you again. That was really awesome. I think this was my first time encountering this theory that was like, that appreciates the value of utopia. Last spring, I read Thomas More's Utopia for the first time, and something about that experience was very jarring as like an example of something that was considered really radical and progressive for the time. But you can also see like this early framework for like the settler colonial, empire building that happened following it. And it's something that kind of made me more timid to even like latch on to certain ideals and kind of see any form of utopia building as like very like cynical and inherently dark. Do you have any like advice for young folks to avoid certain pitfalls of like falling for these like ideals that are actually really harmful?
Maybe the best way to bring this around is actually to talk about political correctness, which I think is really important not to realize, not to conceptualize as a tendency of the left. Political correctness is about making a set of rules hidebound in some way or another, to the point that they become laughable. I'm trying to think of an example. I don't know, maybe like just that, cars are terrible, so we need to entirely do away with cars and nobody will have a car. Like, we just need to get rid of them. Which, of course, doesn't allow for the fact that we still need waste removal and firefighting and things like this. So actually, motorized vehicles are going to be necessary, even if we decide that the personal motor car, or what is now the personal motor lorry in the US, is, needs to go. So I think escaping the trap of political correctness by understanding that ethics are relational, and that we need to apply ethics differently in every different circumstance, is really important. And that's what soap operas do. This is when I talk about ethics, I'm like, everyone thinks they're afraid of ethics, but like everyone loves watching or lots of people love watching soap operas, which are is constantly working through different ethical situations in different circumstances, and the answers are always different. So you could never apply a kind of politically correct solution to any one of those outcomes. So if utopia is a method or a process rather than an expected outcome, then it's allowed to be adaptable. So I think it's just a good practice to say, am I insisting on something inflexibly? Lorraine Daston has a beautiful book called Rules, and she talks about the difference between thick rules and thin rules. Thin rules are rules that are inflexible, but that aren't, actually they just get in our way. Whereas thick rules are situational rules. Thick rules are ones that adapt and move. And this is something that we find in jurisprudence, in different ways in which the law is discussed. What's his name? There's a scholar of jurisprudence who's done some beautiful work on this, and he talks about the difference between the rule of law and the law of rules. And the rule of law is a thick set of rules that are circumstantial and situational and embodied. They're about our real bodies in the world and the way circumstances are different. So there's a whole kind of world to explore there. I used to be almost allergic to law. I was like, right, that's authorities do that, right? And my young punk anarchist self was like, fuck authority. But actually, if law is something that lies upon the land, as I said at the beginning, then it's something that concerns all of us, because we all have a relationship with the land and with each other in substantive landscape spaces. So we all have to think about how we use law and ethics to relate to one another. So now I'm fairly certain that one of my next books is going to be almost entirely focused upon jurisprudence and upon legal land precedents, because it's all of a sudden incredibly interesting to me. Is that kind of, you guys are asking me hard questions, but they're really good, so thank you.
All right, do we have any more questions in the audience? We're good? Awesome, okay, well, Tim, thank you again so much for joining us. We're really great, so happy to have you here. And if we may hold for applause for one moment, I also, as a third party, just want to say thank you so much to the Hopes crew for putting on such an amazing conference. So if we can put on a round of applause for everyone in the space. It's truly been a pleasure to have this effort go on. And, I am not the one to speak on that, so I'm actually going to pass the microphone on to our Hopes leader, Kariana Muller. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. And I think it was really nice to hear that connection back to some of the other speakers. So I hope everyone that was able to join us this weekend has sort of taken something away, whether it's that idea of becoming a propagandist or becoming sort of an organizer or a community builder. And so I hope that we've sort of, as a group, developed a toolkit that we can go on to apply to sort of deconstructing our own institutional structures. I know here on campus, groups like NOMAS are a really big part of that, and so I would encourage you to continue to engage with these concepts as we finish out the term. And with that, I think we are done. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you again to, like Awar was saying, to the team that made this happen. Grace O'Brien, Danielle Castledine, Elise O'Brien, Adele Zeri, Maya Merrill, Nina Ben Gershom, and Abby Brown have all been a really important part of this. So thank you. Sorry, we are holding elections for our organizing team next year. Unfortunately, a lot of us are graduating or moving on.